In December 1940, Hitler's forces struck against the Americans in the Ardennes in Belgium. The surprise blitzkrieg was Germany's last desperate attempt to halt the Allied advance on Berlin. It was a cold and grey morning on December 16, 1944, when the stalemate at the front in Belgium was suddenly broken. Powerful German tanks followed by waves of infantry rolled out of the mist. The one thing no one had thought possible had happened. The Germans had gone on a counter-offensive in the 11th hour. A massive armoured force rolled forward with tremendous power, across a front of around 16 kilometers in the Ardennes forest, triggering panic on the side. Where had this gigantic German strength come from? The Allies had taken it for granted that the Germans had exhausted their reserves. But now, a full 6 months after the invasion of Normandy, and after the Germans had been so thoroughly beaten in France, the German army was demonstrating a force not seen since the first year of the war. Defenses were smashed. Those American forces in the first line of defense were hit by losses of up to 70%. The German tanks cut through one position after another and thundered on through the bloody snow. In some places, they didn't even bother to take prisoners, but simply mowed down those soldiers who surrendered. 84 prisoners of war were massacred in Normandy alone. After 2 months of fighting in Normandy, German resistance in France had collapsed. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944. Over the following weeks, British and US forces swept almost unopposed across eastern France. When victory seemed to be within reach, the Allies became hindered more by their own mistakes than through German resistance. Soon the generals were being advised that High Command hadn't been able to build a transport network to supply the armies with sufficient fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and anything else they needed. They had landed much larger armies than they had the capacity to supply. To a certain extent, these difficulties were exacerbated by the Germans clinging on at French ports along the English Channel, forcing supplies to be transported by road from Normandy. Rail networks smashed to pieces. The problem had also been made more acute because the Allies had bombed France's railway network, forcing them to transport everything the army needed on France's bumpy country roads. In addition, there were many competitive personalities among the Allied generals. The fiercest rivals were American George S. Patton and British Bernard Montgomery, both of whom strived to be first to Berlin. Instead of concentrating attacks on a limited area, Allied forces spread in a fan shape more than 65 kilometers wide. This forced trucks to drive even longer distances. Everywhere British and American generals squabbled over the insufficient supplies. Allied Supreme Commander General Dwight Eisenhower chose a compromise that meant priority constantly changed between the various Allied sectors, with the result that no one got what they needed to deliver a final blow against the remnants of the German forces in the west. Allies halted at the border. Finally, the Allies were forced to break from their advance at the German border. It was against this backdrop that Hitler and his generals prepared their major offensive in the Ardennes. He hoped to inflict such heavy losses on the Americans that as public opinion would demand that the country pull out of the war. The offensive was conducted with customary German skill and efficiency, echoing their heyday from earlier in the war. They chose to attack under cover of a major low-pressure weather system, when low cloud and thick mist hampered the Allied superior air forces. The dense fog also tricked the shocked American soldiers into believing they saw many more German tanks than the actual number. Survivors from the foremost defensive positions fled terrified, contributing to the general confusion. Entire US companies dissolved into panic in scenes reminiscent of the French army's collapse in almost exactly the same area 4.5 years earlier. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled head over heels or surrendered. In this way, more than 30,000 Americans were captured in the space of a few days. The Allied generals were summoned to an emergency meeting in Verdun, and former rivalries were blown away in the face of the German assault. Reinforcements were directed from all quarters towards the Ardennes. The Rs 101st Airborne Division arrived at the focal point at Bastogne in Belgium. By making a stand in the town, the division formed a kind of breakwater that made it difficult for the Germans to move forward. When the weather cleared on 23 December, the Allied air forces could be deployed in full. But the Germans had also built a large air force in the west, 2,300 aircraft, twice the number they possessed when the Allies landed in Normandy. It meant the Allied air forces met with fierce resistance. New surprise from the Germans. In the days between Christmas and New Year, fierce battles raged across Belgium without any decisive outcomes. But on New Year's Day 1945, the Germans had a new surprise waiting for the Allies. Early in the morning, around 1,000 German aircraft struck the Allied airfields in Belgium and eastern France. Although the Germans lost 280 aircraft, they managed to take out nearly 500 Allied planes. Meanwhile, German ground troops had also advanced further south to attack the 7th Army in Alsace. Eisenhower, who feared the 7th Army might collapse completely, diverted forces from the Ardennes to Alsace, which gave the Germans a fresh advantage where the first advance had halted. On January 6, 1945, Winston Churchill contacted Joseph Stalin to ask if there was any possibility of the Red Army helping to relieve pressure in the West by accelerating its plans for a winter offensive in Poland. Stalin replied without hesitation to help his allies, and on January 12, 1945, the most powerful offensive of World War II commenced when the Red Army unleashed its vengeful fury against the German armies in Poland and East Prussia. In just a few days, the entire German Eastern Front collapsed. Hitler was left with no choice than to transfer almost his entire air force and the 6th Panzer Army from the west to the east. By early February 1945, the Allies had re-established their front in the Ardennes and were ready to push on into Germany itself.